Mishika Singh, who is the founder of NEEV, Foundation for Legal Aid. We have Mrinalini Ravindranath, who is a research associate with the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project in Bhopal. Also present is Chandni Chawla, who is currently practicing criminal law at the Bombay High Court. We have Jeevika Shiv, who is a feminist social worker, a lawyer, and a right to food campaign worker. And we have Malavika Rajkumar, who works as a project associate with IP for Change. Welcome, all of you. Today's discussion focuses on two things. One, the gendered nature of our idea of justice, and also the process of seeking justice in India. We want to understand the panel's on-ground experiences of working in the legal and policy sector, gaps in laws and policies, and what the road ahead could look like for us. I'm going to start with a question for all of our panelists. What does the idea of justice mean to you? We can start with Chandni.
Well, I think the idea of justice for me, for now, is like we define it ourselves, right? So the question for me is looking at restorative justice practices. And I think it's very important to hear from survivors of crime themselves what their idea of justice means and taking into account their voice. So I think that is the idea of justice for me.
Thank you, Chandni. Malavika.
I think in my mind, I see justice as a sort of system that's designed that's not just inclusive, but intersectional. So in any sort of area that you take, like, for example, I work in digital rights, I see the gap in these two areas. If you take any particular kind of crime that's happening against a woman, you see many issues intersecting on these 2 points. So I think access to justice can only be achieved if we can identify and address these two critical points to start with.
That makes a lot of sense. Mishika?
I think I want to elaborate on what Chandni said, that it's important to understand what the survivors understand as justice. And since I work with a lot of women, my organization works with women on domestic violence and other gender-based crimes, we've come to realize that for them, justice is not just about getting a legal remedy. It's not about getting an order from the court. It's also about the trauma that they've gone through to address that. There's some support in that area that they need. There's also gathering parts of their lives and starting again. There's dealing with children and how to explain to them what has happened and for them to move forward with the kind of changes that have taken place. So overall, the idea of restorative justice really needs to actually be understood from these different segments, is what my experience has taught me. And of course, it's always evolving depending on the kind of things that we see in everyday life. But as of today, this is what I think some aspects of justice that comes over and above the litigation and the legal side of justice.
Thank you, Mishika. Jeevika?
First of all, I want to congratulate all of you on having a young feminist panel. I think we speak of values of intersectionality and age being one of them and voices in the sector being less. So fantastic. Thank you for doing this. It's great to be here. I think for me, I'm going to problematize justice beyond legal justice, to actually look at it from a Bahujan lens, look at it from an intersectional lens, to say being able to center voices of those who are most affected by injustices is a spectrum of justice. How do you look at them not only participating, but being decision makers in processes that inform how we design justice, moving beyond the binary of crime and non-crime, looking at restoration, love, care, looking at communities and individuals and where they place themselves. Also having worked in rural communities, worked in most marginalized communities, how do you also look at different spectrums of justice that different communities have? And how do you build them in the framework of human rights and constitutional discourses at this point of time, which becomes more and more critical at a time when justice is being diluted to just mean procedure. And also fair procedure for the most vulnerable. How do you center them? I think some of these ideas is what I think feminist justice looks like. So when I say justice in my head, it's clearly feminist in its intersections, but also within that, who's deciding what's justice? I think even deciding beyond just the judicial framework to other spaces, and how do we also come in to look at what survivors or even those who are in speaking about justice, because I think the only frame of survivors is now reductionist. We must look beyond to other stakeholders as well. So just some of those thoughts.
Thank you, Jeevika. Mrinalini?
Hi. So I would also, I'm also thinking about justice in terms of how we redress harm and who gets to have it redressed. So I would like to maybe complicate the question a little bit and think along two lines. Is the idea of justice that we want to imagine tied to lawmaking, and do we want to rely on law as the primary tool to be engineering social change? And do we still want to continue doing that? The second being, while of course the law is an important site for securing rights for oppressed communities, how does it but relate to the conception of a society or a system that is unjust, and how is it unjust, and for whom and in what ways? Because we see privileging of certain voices over others. The women's movement also has primarily engaged with law as a site for justice, right? And something that we're also seeing replicated by some factions within the queer movement now. But what is the picture? What is the picture of justice that it has sought to instill? I think that conversation is maybe necessary also for us to think about alternative imaginations of this. For us, I think caste is the fundamental marker of stratification that we see within society. But the question I want to think about then is if the feminist vision for justice that we're all thinking about is also an anti-caste one.
Just these answers show how complicated and like how essential this conversation is. Now I'm going to move on to questions specific to panelists. So Chandni, the first question is for you. Can you give us some examples of how written statutes in India currently present a challenge for women in their pursuit for justice?
Well, there's a host of list, I think, which all of us would like to talk about. But I think I just talk about the recent ongoing debates which are going on currently in the country. One is on marital rape, and when we talk of women's rights, when we talk of rights of married women, we still see that marital rape is not a crime in India. And I think that's a huge thing. It's a stark example of how the law itself is in a way saying that, no, I mean, marital rape cannot be a crime. The second issue, I think, which is not directly related to what is written in the statute, but which is also currently being debated, is the hijab issue, right? When we talk of religion and we talk of the constitution, right? And when we talk of, again, intersection here, right? Because we're talking of rights of Muslim women, their right to be able to propagate their own religion. So how is the constitution, how is the different statutes of Karnataka allowing that, not allowing that? I don't know if we followed some of the hearings at the Karnataka High Court, but we see stereotypes coming in. And I think as a practicing lawyer, more than anything else, what I see day in and day out in court is stereotyping, is misogyny, is patriarchy. And I think that becomes a huge problem for survivors of any kind of crime, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's a woman was accused of murder, right? So these are the different spectrum of people I represent, and I see that the challenges they face are gendered, are clearly intersecting with their class, with their caste, with their age, with their disability. And I think all of this cannot be put into a statute, but all of this has to come into practice, right? All of this has to come into our daily ways in how we perceive justice. And I mean, we've all spoken of intersections here, but does a judge who is sentencing a person, does he or she look at any intersections? That is the question I think we must ask ourselves. And I think that is the question I think people, I mean, we all here work on different issues, but looking at intersections, looking at challenges, and which law cannot address, because these are challenges which are not written in the law, right? Challenges come based on different ways where people are. Like, I could just give a small example of a case I did where a young woman accused her own father of sexual abuse. And what the judge did, which was completely illegal, was set up like a counseling in the court at a stage of anticipatory bail. Said that, oh, your mom says this hasn't happened. Oh, but you say this has happened. Do you know the consequences of your action? Do you want your father to go to jail? And oh, you're so young. So this is the kind of attitude, mentality, which goes behind when you're talking of, let's say, gender-based crime, right? The judge set up a counseling there, a mediation there, which was completely illegal, and granted bail to the man, saying that this is a father. It's clearly next to impossible that he could have done this with his daughter. So this is where misogyny and patriarchy come in, and I think that is what we need to address. And today being International Women's Day, no other day can be as great as discussing this. So yeah.
Thank you, Chandni. I think you're right. Beyond just statutes, even people who are supposed to uphold them for others need to sort of unlearn all of these things before we can move forward and even have a discussion about what's there in the statutes. Mrinalini, my next question is for you. So we know how gender and caste cannot be spoken of separately when it comes to matters of justice in India. We have the case of Mathura and Soni Suri that both exemplify how state violence and repression is tied to the body of Adivasi women. If you could throw some light on why the spatial dynamics of police custody are inherently violent and unsafe for women of marginalized communities.
So I'm going to take some time with my answer on this. And I do want to begin by extending my gratitude for work and the resistance of Dalit Bahujan Adivasi folks that contribute to this alternative imagination for justice and that also make our work possible and my own learning. Some of the research and ideas that I'm talking about are from earlier seminal work that's been done by the CPA project and by other thoughts from other members that have contributed to this. I think I've stated earlier, but we see caste as being a thread unifying all concerns about justice, not just for feminist engagement as a lens, but as the very framework that props up the law and the imagination of rights, and through all different thematic issues that the other speakers are also going to share about, but I'm going to be a little more limited within the criminal justice system and our work. I think my answer will be in two parts. One, talking a little bit about the feminist engagement with the law and the issue of sexual violence and how we see, how we want to build a perspective around caste on this. And the second being the criminalization of women who are seen as outliers to this norm of the caste system. In the first part, I just want to begin with, the question of sexual violence has been the primary point of organizing for the women's movement in India, right? So two themes that kind of come out is that the feminist project of relying on the letter of the law or as criminalization with better, stronger laws against sexual violence that hopefully will redress the problem itself. And the second of who appears as a survivor of sexual violence before the criminal justice system and how they appear. But since you mentioned the Mathura case, I'll begin with that in that it was exceptional in the way it sparked outrage and it witnessed the first of its kind movement with women's groups propping up. And it also resulted in the construction of the custodial rape category within as an exceptional point of rape. But two things that we want to, I think, that add on to this discussion is that the focus of outrage and the focus of the case was more about Mathura's behavior and just general behavior of a survivor of sexual violence and how it should not be central to prosecuting rape. That in that silence should not be deemed to be consent, or being habituated to sex is not consent. Actually, we see this behavior as being constructed along lines of sexual norms which are dictated by honor, by caste purity, by chastity, all of which are markers of Brahminical patriarchy on dominant caste women, which don't necessarily apply to all women. And there's also a deafening silence around the question of structural violence in this context, given that it was a tribal girl situated in a conflict region in Maharashtra, and that the exertion of state power through the police in these situations, it's not something we had critiqued at that time. So we see caste as being in the shadow, and the understanding that criminal justice system, particularly the police, routinely targets DBA communities and causes suppression is also missing there. The second thing here is also that in the conception of the protest itself, and this was something that was only brought to my notice earlier, while I'd known that women's groups organizing at the time had not reached out to Mathura and that they weren't standing with her throughout the process of the different court proceedings. And there was one person, Seema Sakde, who did visit her. But Radha Kumar also notes that actually when there were protests that were organized on International Working Women's Day on March 8th, nobody invited Mathura for the protest until a day before it was scheduled. And when then she was asked about it, she said she would not join, but that she was actually indifferent to this protest. I think that speech and the silence thereof earlier is very telling for us. even with the Bhavani Devi case, we see that she was raped as a result of her work in stopping a child marriage of a dominant caste family, right? And she was raped by 5 men. The trial court noted that they acquitted the people, and they noted that it was impossible for the rape to have occurred, given that that rural gangs could not have a mixing of castes, since the accused persons belonged to different castes. And the second, that it was impossible that Indian rural society would lose the sense of caste that they maintain and do this to a woman. So I think this kind of language is something that we've not interrogated about the case. And after this, when the PIL was filed, it was filed on the basis of protecting women in both formal and informal sectors. And the idea that workplace harassment is discrimination was brought about, and which was laudable at the time. But we don't make any mention of the fact that there was a particular vulnerability of Bhavani Devi in the case, and of any female worker in the workforce, which is compounded by caste, right? So this case, I think, it tells us classically about power rape, which is entrenched in the caste system, in the Brahminical idea of power. And yet we see the absence of understanding caste as it plays out in the workplace, or even in power differential relationships. Then the kind of analysis that we might want to do in just relegating different identities as being just intersectional, but not as a concerted effort, it just becomes a superfluous exercise. And especially sexual harassment at the workplace is a manifestation of the oppressive structures that do exist. And they've rendered Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi women as being more vulnerable than elsewhere, because also they're primarily relegated to the informal workspace. Now, shifting a little bit, I want to talk about Bilkis Banu's case, where we see the 15-year-old long fight that she had to prosecute her rapist and to secure her dignity through compensation. And we laud this, but we also recognize in a limited sense that the state repression that was extended, yes, it was done by bad actors who were in power, but we don't look at this as an issue of structural violence perpetrated by the state, given the kind of power we've given to them. We don't problematize also the time that it took here, right? But given that this was a person from a marginalized community, and the power of the state that we've contributed to magnifying by relying on the state to prosecute and address sexual violence only through criminal law. So I think this becomes also more complicated when we come back to think about Adivasi resistance and conflict regions, particularly where women's bodies are used as a site for inflicting political violence. Since you've referred to the EPW piece that CPA had written, I want to quote from there to say that to control such women and consequently to control natural resources, the state deploys violence and creates an environment of fear and to establish dominance. We also see the state project of civilizing women in different ways in Madhya Pradesh too, but I'll come to that. In the successive organizing that we've seen around rape and typically around these high profile cases that have happened, we've still relied on criminal law to a different note to call for stricter laws around implementation and this new thing of minimum mandatory sentencing and death sentences. With the bit about implementation, we see the silence around speaking about caste and its very roots in the structures that we've propped up, in that not everyone is treated with the same level of protection, right? I think Chandni has also referred to this. When a Dalit or a Bahujan or an Adivasi woman who's been a victim of violence tries to access the court of law, or even as in the case of Bilkis Banu, her experience will be different from that of a victim who's from a dominant.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just one thing, but it can be also for someone who has no support system or.
Sorry, 1 second.
Sorry, I'm Risha.
We'll take questions from audience later. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to just
No worries. Thank you. Sorry, Mrinalini, go ahead.
No, we do acknowledge sexual violence as being endemic to women's lives and being a difficult process. I think even all of the other speakers have talked about this in the introduction, but I do want to say that a lot of these experiences are fundamentally marked by caste. And even as we see the Me Too movement as being a great point of divergence in how we engage with the law as feminists, we've also seen the privileging of voices and contexts that portray who is able to speak before the law, right? And to add on to this point is also that we've seen limited intervention from the mainstream movement in prosecuting rape as part of the Prevention of Atrocities Act. So all of the reforms that we fought for in the IPC, they've not been extended to the Atrocities Act, and the poor convictions that are there, the poor implementation that's there, also added by the concerted effort to dilute the law, all of this remains unaddressed. And just adding one more point onto this is that we must critique also the reliance on increasing punishment as a resort to addressing sexual violence. It shows a limited approach about thinking about how to redress harm, especially given that the criminal justice system is structured the way that it is, and it ignores the needs of survivors. In the context of our work in Madhya Pradesh, we work with communities that were previously labeled as criminals by birth through the Criminal Tribes Act. And since its repealing in 1952, they've also begun to be relegated as habitual offenders, given that the labeling has continued. These denotified tribes, because as they were referred to administratively after the repealing of the Criminal Tribes Act, or through self-expression as they term themselves as Vimukta Jatis, they've remained outside the fold of the caste system. But still, it's interesting to see that they experience casteist oppression still in a very state-mandated manner. All members of criminal tribes were and are subject to intensive and intrusive surveillance by police stations and police officials at regular intervals. And what we found is that the practice of maintaining a detailed register of their whereabouts is still institutionalized as a practice without interrogating it. And consequent to this is also a practice of the practice of filing multiple cases against persons from these communities is quite rampant. And these are the cases that we do take on. From colonial times to post-independent India, we've seen that women were relegated as being loose or easily available, and this was for all Indian women. But the project of civilizing these women has been complicated further by caste and those who perform caste-based occupation, such as performance arts, which a lot of people from Vimukta communities were relegated to doing.
Mrinalini, I'm so sorry, I have to remind you that we're running short on time. So if you could just
30 seconds. Yeah, great. 30 seconds. So we see that sexual violence is still a common tool of the civilizing power that's exerted by police as agents of the state. We see violence being used as against Vimukta women as a means to do crime control. In an earlier incident when a murder of a dominant caste woman had happened, and it was pinned on Padi individuals, there was of course backlash by the dominant caste persons in burning down Padi settlements in the village. But what was also uncovered by WSS was that there was a gang rape of about 10 Vimukta women from the area by police officers, which went unnoticed to date and unprosecuted. I think the use of rape in this tragedy also by dominant caste men and by police officers exemplifies the use of sexual violence as a tool of retribution, right? I think I can end now. I do want to ask the question about how we can think about different modes of engagement beyond the criminal justice system and what that should look like. While there is some attempt we've seen with the domestic violence law, but how do we center, as Jeevika had mentioned, how do we center the voices of oppressed persons in this process also?
Mrinalini, maybe you can come back to this in your closing remarks, if that's okay. All right, thank you so much. Next, we have Mishika. Mishika, Neve has hosted multiple legal awareness camps for women. If you could tell us a little bit about the attitudes that were hardest to change in these camps, and if you were able to discern quantifiable differences.
So we've been doing camps pre-COVID and post-COVID virtually as well. I think one of the biggest challenges that we faced, it's actually two of them. One is that there's a very big gap in the legal awareness that's out there, and that's equally true for women living in slums, but also educated women having their jobs and going to work in big organizations. Some of the myths that are around law, because they've whatever they've seen about law is from these movies or media that doesn't really cover things properly. Like for dowry, people know that asking for dowry is a crime, but accepting dowry or giving dowry is also a crime. It's both ways. That's one of the things that we realized, that, they say, humne to diya tha, par maang to unhone ki thi. So that's something, that gap is there even at levels where you think education would make this clear. We work with a lot of women who've suffered from domestic violence, or are still suffering from it. And in that case, that's been sort of the opposite, that in cases of women, especially who are coming from educated backgrounds, even they acknowledge violence as only physical. They're not aware of the other kinds of violence that exist. So the gap in the legal awareness generally amongst women has been tremendous. And that's something that we've been looking to sort of bridge. That being said, once we get to the place where we can educate them about certain laws, different forms and different reflections of patriarchy are being seen at every level, in every community that we go to, in every workshop that we've had. In one of these workshops, I was, for the lack of a better word, heckled by some of these older women who insisted that I talk about that, agar hamari bahu galat case karne ki dhamki de rahi hai, to usse pehle batao ki kya hoga. So, that was their concern, that if you're telling us about the law, also tell us that what can we do if a case that is being filed against us is false. Because their understanding, again, is that if our son is coming home drunk and raising his hand, that he's a man. So, it's not such a big deal. So that notion has been very difficult to break. And that has also translated in other problematic areas. One other area that has been difficult for us to sort of navigate is how neatly the caste system works. It's propagated by upper caste and it's accepted by the lower caste. So if there is any sort of legal violation that is happening, it is a norm that if an upper caste has done something to a lower caste, it's fine. The tolerance level for something like that is much higher. It's not seen as a legal violation. So even when they're told about what the law says and what their rights are, because these people live in certain communities, that's not something that they want to even acknowledge as their right being violated. Like they don't want to acknowledge it in front of an upper caste person, or confront them with it, that this is how that you violated my rights. The third, which has gained prominence in the last 1 year, is there's a very, very significant communal divide that we can see. The talking of, like, when women are engaging with each other, even if the seminar or the workshop that we do is talking about what to do if the police is not letting you file an FIR, or if they're not taking your complaint seriously, or making you run around and asking for things that are not required, or harassing you, even if it's something that general, this idea of a Hindu woman and a Muslim woman gets very defined in these areas. And the way they are treated, the way their issues are addressed, has been very different and difficult for one community to access as compared to the other. In fact, now what has happened is that because the communal divide has become so much, even when a man has to go to a police station for whatever reason, he prefers that he sends a woman from their household, because they know that their community is being seen a certain way by the police in that area. So those are some of the issues that we have been dealing with. And wherever we can go personally, we have engaged personally. And, sort of the police should know that there's someone looking out for them. A lot of times people in authority or in these power places sort of, it gets to the head that nahi karenge to koi kya kar lega. That attitude of if we refuse, then they have nowhere to go. I think that's also the mindset that we try to change, that not everyone is alone. Maybe 9 out of 10 people will just go away because they don't know how to access the legal framework further, but at least that one person will have someone looking out for them. So these are the ways we've been trying to sort of figure out things that can be changed. But one thing I've realized, Shreyasi, is that every community, no matter how many similarities they have a very different way of functioning when you get to the micro level of it. Roles are defined. Everyone's place in that community is defined. Depending on their age, how a woman is seen is defined. If there's a working woman belonging to a certain age, then some violence taking place against her is acceptable in those communities, because she's of the age where she should be married. And the only way she can be granted that status in the eyes of the other people is if she complies with what the community is looking at. So we've been trying to break, these things and sort of make sense of them. But one of the bigger problems is that we interact with these people once a month. Then we sometimes go back for a workshop, sometimes we don't go back for a workshop. So after that, it's only the people who want to stay in touch with us who can do that. Rest of the people, they have to continue living in that community. So for them, the laws of that community are stronger than what the law actually says, what the legal system actually says. So that's something that we sort of trying to change, like get that attitude shift, sort of change, finding strength in numbers, that if more people from a particular community decide to take action about something illegal that is happening, or something that's violating a community's right or a person's right, if there's strength in numbers, then that is bound to eventually change. So these are some of the things that we have looked at, and like I said, it's a work in progress. So there's a lot of learning for us also when we're breaking these rounds. Every experience is a new experience, but the heckling one was, I think, the biggest learning experience that I did have. That eventually you have to give people what they want, no matter how much you want to train them about something that we think they need. It's about what they need at that point in time.
Thank you so much, Mishika. It sounds like tremendous work. My next question is for Malavika. Malavika, the discourse around AI obscures the exploitation of women's bodies by big tech and also the lack of appropriate governance frameworks. The digital economy needs new thinking for revamping legal institutional mechanisms at both national and subnational levels, so that they protect women's rights to economic participation, livelihood, security, and well-being. So how do we respond to the opportunities and threats for gender equality in the digital economy?
Thank you, Shreyasi. And rightly pointed out, the yin and yang is that there's a celebratory discourse on AI where everyone's very happy with it and the development that has come forth with AI. And then there's big tech exploiting their powers, and the ones that are being affected are disproportionately are women. And I think what I'm trying to argue in the next 2-3 minutes is that economic rights, securing economic rights is very integral to access to justice. I think I'm also a lawyer. So what happens is that when I think of access to justice, I think of it in terms of the courtroom, I think of it in terms of institutions, but I want to unpack how AI plays a specific role in impeding access to justice. And I actually found a couple of examples, so I could particularly highlight some points. But I think it's safe to say that the global economy these days have been Uberized, for lack of a better term. Everything is about platform companies and how they treat their employees. It directly ties back to a labor rights issue at all points. And there was a 2017 innovation analysis report that said that out of the top 10 transnational companies, 5 of them were platforms. So what actually happens is that when there is constant development and talks on development, there is always a glib version of women's rights that is discussed with it, like a tokenized version. It could be some ethical principles that are framed by the company that don't mean anything. But there's always a tokenized version of some form of women's rights happening within these companies. One of the main problems that comes out of this is that lives and livelihoods are under siege. For example, we all know that the AI rating systems in Uber, Urban Clap, Swiggy, Zomato, all of them directly affect the livelihood of the women who engage with it, or any person for that matter. But specifically when we are looking at the way it affects women, I think the most notable example is in 2021 in Delhi, near Gurgaon, there were rampant protests by Urban Clap women for the unfair policies that they had put. What actually happened was that there was a new subscription system where they said that they have to pay a deposit amount, and on top of that, complete a monthly target of 40 jobs. for protesting, and this is a right of resistance that a woman has, Urban Company has now filed a case against them, silencing them even more, and now they are under threat for raising their labor rights. So this is one example in terms of the hypocrisy that comes from these platforms who are supposed to hand you equity, but they don't. And another example, which is a well-noted example that happened in Uber in the US, there's actually a blog by Susan Fowler. She talks about how she went and complained about how her manager sent her sexual texts telling, and it was very obvious he wanted to have sex with her. And when she reported it to HR, assuming that Uber, being such a big company, would have a standard approach for this, they said that he was a high performer and that they wouldn't feel comfortable punishing him for an innocent mistake on his part. And effectively, she had to leave her job. This is something that we also constantly see through all our sexual harassment at workplace prosecutions, internal complaint committee behaviors that happen within workplaces. The woman suffers at the end. So apart from this, something else that happens is that AI creates a patriarchal system of dispossession and exploitation. By this, I mean that because of these capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal systems, it's always a question of extraction of data all the time. So how much data can you extract from a woman is the big picture question that's here. And this, in the end, like what disappears is that women's labor is what is driving digital economy. It is a labor of women working in the agricultural sector that is driving the startups that give quick food to us, be it Zepto, be it Big Basket, be it Grofers. This is all the labor of movements on the ground. And one example that I can think of this is Amazon released in 2017 a really problematic hiring algorithm where, and it's still happening, many hiring algorithms happen in the US as compared to India, but what happened was Amazon system penalized any CV that had the word woman in it. So what finally happened was that if in your CV you said that you were part of the women's chess club, they would reject you from candidacy for Amazon US. And this became apparent when the hiring practices for that year had a lot of like cis male men being hired. And finally, when it came out, they said, oh, this is a big mistake. Oh, this is a problem with AI. But the thing about AI is that AI, if this is AI, I think all the data sets that you feed into it create an AI. So there was inherent bias when the program was created in the first place. So this is what happens when we look at menstrual apps, for example. The other day I had like one of those smartwatches where they're like, they'll take my menstrual data, remind me when my cycle is coming. And I definitely felt like all this is going somewhere, and that is true. There are studies that show, like, for example, Plan International in 2018 did a study where what happened was out of the 36 apps that they tested, menstrual apps, 61% shared data without asking the user to Facebook. Now, Facebook takes this data and makes targetized ads for you. So it's around, and then you end up spending your money on the targetized ad that Facebook gives you. So it's like a complete circle of exploitation where they take free data from us, create a product and sell it back to us. Like it's, in fact, these are the dominant structures of power created by AI. And the biggest problem is that there is no binding framework for this data constitutionalism, this AI constitutionalism, which is where the problem happens, because when we think of AI legislation, we see it as anti-discriminatory, equality, but we need to look at the source code, we need to look at business malpractice, we need to look at economic rights. Like these are some important points. And another thing that comes to mind is the reversal of the gender equality gains. So there was a World Economic Forum report that said that by 2026, 50% of the jobs owned by women are going to be replaced by digital automation. I think this is something that is already happening now, but a lot of positions of labor that women take are mid-level routine cognitive jobs. So ITFC had actually done a study on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a sort of marketplace where you can sign up for jobs and you have these one-on-one contracts on that platform. And I just want to take an example of one of the women who told her story. So anonymizing her name, Jayashree was 24 years old from Tamil Nadu, lives with her mother. And after she finished her BCA, the pandemic hit and it became very difficult for her to get a job. So using her cousin's ID, she created an AMT profile where she went online and she was able to make 10 to 15,000 a month. Sitting like working from home on data entry and a lot of other tasks like that. Later, what happened was as the pandemic came through, and this is where we also see all these platforms are figuring out how to exploit women more and more. They came up with such a horrible system that despite her having a high amount of tasks completed, a lot of the jobs went to US, women in the US or white men in the US and Indians. So there was a racial bias that AMT had in the first place because of their AI that resulted in a woman like Jayashree not able to get jobs, thus earning lesser income. She earned less than 6,000 when the pandemic was at its peak, and there was no choice to go out and move and earn because it happened so suddenly, disrupted so many livelihoods. So that is the harsh reality of the way AI actually works. And the weird part is we only know like of the popular platforms, but like there are so many criterias of approval and rejection that can really destroy livelihoods. For example, on urban
Malavika,
sorry.
we're
Yeah.
running out of time. If you could
Sure.
come back to this. In
I
a
think
minute.
I'll wrap up in 30 seconds,
Good,
but
yeah.
all I wanted to say was that in urban clap, it may be like, I think this is where you need to check your privilege, right? You think, oh, my manicure is not done so well, and you give a bad rating. This is feeding into an AI that's going to correspondingly penalize this woman. So there are like consequences to your digital actions also. So I think apart from that, I think my main area of work is cyber violence and the kind of cyber violence that happens. And when we analyzed cases, Chandni, Mishika, I think all the things you said happened. Basically, Victorian era legislations where they focus on modesty and not on right to privacy. I don't know why it's not happening these days. Secondly, inherent patriarchy in courtrooms in many situations, and a lot of cases of non-consensual image sharing. So what I want to finally argue is that access to justice equals women's rights, equals labor rights, equals economic rights. So you cannot segregate it and always view it from a legalistic point of view. And especially since AI has come in, it becomes even more tricky because internationally there is no normative framework for AI right now. So that is a big problem. China has gone to overregulate in their country, if you read about it, but in India or internationally, there's no consensus on AI regulation. So I think that is a answer to like the solution to the question you asked, but I felt like I needed to explain all this to get to that. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You're right. Gender rights equals economic rights, which brings me to my next question for Jeevika. So more than 22,000 Anganwadi workers and helpers from all over Delhi had gathered at the gates of Vikas Bhavan to demand better pay and working conditions. So Jeevika, how do you think policymakers in the Delhi government are to provide Anganwadi workers the status of government employees and all the benefits that come with it that also adhere to labor laws currently?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to go to the history of the informal worker, right? And within that, the Anganwadi worker, the first mile, the frontline worker, which is the woman, right? You're looking at all women workers being exploited. And you're looking at this not only in Delhi. We've been speaking to at least 10 states where we've seen this, and we've seen this over the years in this government and the previous government. The Right to Food campaign has raised, and it has a separate space for Anganwadi workers. Also to recognize, apart from the CANRC, this is one of the biggest women workers protests that's happened, and women's protests that's happened. Of course, women farmers as well. So I think we're seeing the informal sector ask for a visibilization where there's invisibilization, both of labor, of dignity, of time, understanding of social protection. And I think that's where we need to broaden the labor spectrum itself. right? When we think of traditional labor rights, we think of those in unions, we think of those in formal workspaces. At the most, we'll talk about sexual harassment at the workplace, and that to formal workplaces, right? So what do we do about 92% of an informal workforce, whether it's Narega workers, which is the employment guarantee workers, which is such a spectrum in our country, whether it's women farmers, right, who are doing most of your work. You're looking at 79% of labor force in the farms being women in India. So how do you problematize it in that context? Coming specifically to Delhi government, and I think for any government at this point of time, there's an absolute lack of understanding of the poor woman, of the woman who goes into Anganwadi services, and within that, the caste that they belong to, right? There is an absolute erasure of where they come from. There's been studies shown during the pandemic that their work timings have increased by 3 times, right? Like 5 hours to 15 hours. That's not even what we work. We're looking at less than minimum wages and an absolutely indignified understanding of how to deal with them, how to speak to them, how to, stop. And you're looking at now a spectrum of threatened with criminalization, threatening families. And these are people who are saying that just give us basic work rights. What does that mean? It means give us basic equipment, don't make us document too much, document what is necessary. This whole data economy exploits us of putting it in 10 places without any final results, make us part of decisions on how we can be governed, right? We're a big workforce. We also are community workers. The point of these workers was to build community resilience towards malnutrition, towards healthcare, towards food systems, build better practices of access. And it's completely been exploited. So I think that's the one frame that one needs to look at. Within this, the Delhi government has also completely denied, except to give some tokenistic raise of money in words, right? But they're not asking for money only. They're saying, of course, we must be paid basic minimum that we're demanding and much more, which is a dignified wage, but we also need better spaces, a workforce understanding. And if you don't bring us into the formal workforce, you're going to exploit us even further. And, when you don't bring a whole female workforce, and I think this is not a question of just these workers, it's forest rights workers, it's, and especially you look at invisibilized work, you look at sanitation workers, it's a completely invisibilized thing. It's not even being talked about because it's caste-based completely, right? You look at those who are looking at food production systems. So I think the larger spectrum of justice needs to address social protection. It needs to address decent work. It needs to look at unpaid work. And which is what this is not only care work. Again and again, we say while care work needs to be contributed to, recognized, unpaid care work is done on the hands of poor, marginalized, vulnerable, lower caste, tribal and Dalit and Bahujan and minority women. So we are looking at them completely out of the workforce, while the formal sector has only 1% Muslims, right? So we are not even looking at the spectrum and making rights that are justiciable. So what comes to your legal courts, what comes to even your criminal justice courts, and I say labor courts and criminal justice courts is just 5% of this spectrum. And I think that's what these workers are demanding for. And that's why some of us have continued to say that till you actually look at their social protection rights, till you look at their worker rights, till then you're not going to get, and look at it in a gendered way, because there's no other men force which is being exploited in such a way that the whole women spectrum is. So I think that's my, and I think even in this negotiating through men, speaking about intersections, and I think yesterday I heard the IAS officer in charge of WCD, Rashmi ji, talk about an intersectional multi-sectoral approach. And I think below that, right, where I sort of appreciated it, there was the Anganwadi workers who came in and said, what about us? So again, what are we talking about if we can't put it in practice at the basic level at the capital of our country, right? And these workers at least have a voice. So just, I think we need to start problematizing justice, and especially those who are at the front lines of community. And we must start working with a community-based approach to this, because I think that's where the answers lie. Because what you demand, or what the government thinks, right? The government thinks that you must have just money as a solution. They're saying, no, it's not the solution. It is also giving us a dignified right to labor, to stand in our community as women. These are women who may not have stepped out of their houses. They're the first mile respondents to violence today. They're the first mile respondents to child protection, because you don't have the worker of the juvenile justice system now at the community. So I think also listening to what communities want and working with them to navigate their communities is definitely what they're asking for.
Thank you so much, Jeevika. So I understand that Chandni has a hard stop at 4:10. Maybe we can go on to closing remarks and then we will come to questions. So and I think the whole discussion was about how just the existence of legal remedies cannot be a measure of women's access to justice, right? So how do you think we can navigate these challenges moving forward, and any other closing remarks that you may have? And we'll just go one by one again, starting from Chandni.
I can't think of what we can do outside the legal justice system, but I can think of what we can do within. I think that's what I will focus on. And I'd like to hear from the others on what we can do outside. And I think the biggest challenge to access to justice is poor quality of legal aid. So I think that's where my focus would lie, right? That because if I look at the number of clients I have and the number of people who are in prison, how many % of them actually have access to good legal aid lawyers? How many % have actually met their legal aid lawyers or even interacted with them even at one point of time? So I think improving, pumping in funds, demanding that from our state is, I think, something which I would look at if we want to look at reforms within the legal justice system at this point of time. The other thing I'd look at is sensitization within the system. If we are currently in the system, so we need to sensitize our lawyers, we need to sensitize the other stakeholders, the police machinery, our judges, and I think at all levels, right? It's not just lower court judiciary, but also high court judiciary, also Supreme Court judiciary. So I think these are two things which I could think of moving forward. It's improvement in legal aid, and it is increasing sensitization and bringing in an intersectional lens within the framework of how we look at justice. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chandni. Malavika?
Yeah, I think particularly in terms of we had recently done a study where we had looked at effects of online violence and the sort of challenges that come for digital crimes. So I think some of the points that came out of that directly is something that applies across the spectrum, which is because of the kind of harms that happened online and how that's not taken seriously. It's so easy for trolls to just come and declare rape threats against women online and just disappear after that. I think court spaces need to recognize the online offline continuum, how it directly affects you, how offline issues seen purely offline and online issues seen purely online. I think that divide is a big problem. And secondly, access to justice for marginalized communities. I mean, out of the 100 cases that I had studied, not even one was coming from a marginalized community. And that itself says a lot about even putting a foot in the door in the court system. So that itself is a problem. And I think we need to move beyond all these modesty provisions. I find them extremely problematic. 354 IPC, 506, 509. I think we need to start recognizing crimes, be it offline, online. I think all of them can be recognized from a violation of privacy angle, which is something that's very necessary and now possible after 2018. So I think that would also be for example, judge many high court cases. Let's say you can't do it in district courts, at least in the high courts, it's possible for at the stage of anticipatory bail to deny bail saying that you violated a woman's privacy, but not in the form of benevolent sexism, which is what we usually see where someone tries to save someone. So, and I think the last point I want to say is there is significant power imbalance among parties that come to court. And that is something we see in and out of many cases. I think that needs to be recognized. For example, the Priya Ramani case had to become so high profile and there was still a power imbalance issue that was awfully visible. And why did it have to happen 30 years later, right? And that is someone coming from a place of privilege. So I think all these issues, I think I see all these within courtrooms as challenges, but offline, I think skill building, allowing collective bargaining, for example, movements, I think some of the labor codes are sort of restricting that. So I think all of that is very much required to enhance economic participation of women. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Mishika, we'll go to you next.
I completely agree with what was said about, the poor quality of legal aid. I was in the Delhi High Court Legal Services Committee office the other day, and there was one litigant who came and, they were basically saying that the lawyer that we have, we don't like and we need another lawyer because they're not doing what we want them to do. And, they're just telling us that this is all that they'll do. So basically the whole reason why we came to court, that's not sort of being taken care of. And this was a couple of matrimonial cases. So I do agree with the fact that eventually the quality of legal aid has to improve. You can't expect people to be able to pay for lawyers. And so many of these cases that are now coming to High Court, these people had lawyers previously. Either they didn't appear or didn't take care of it properly, or for whatever reason, they just did what they wanted to do. And that was the best that they did. So definitely one thing would be to look at legal aid more closely and have better checks and balances of what's going on, especially at the lower courts. High Court, I think, is still more refined and things are taken care of better. But I think with lower courts, I think that is definitely required. Whenever something like this happens, when a question is about, what can be changed, I usually go back to the Justice Verma Committee report. It has so many wonderful recommendations. It talks about police reforms. It talks about gender sensitization. It talks about a bunch of things that we've conveniently just dropped. We made some amendments, and that's about the easiest things that we had to do. Just changed, what the law says, that's all we did. But to make it a more holistic picture, to give it a better impact, those pieces are still missing. We still don't have most of the things that are given under the Justice Verma Committee report. And I think that document is right there. Like, it's not like another research has to be done. And fortunately or unfortunately, even 10 years down the line, we're honestly at the same space. Women are still not very safe. Gender access to justice is still problematic. So it's not like a lot of progress has been made, that document has lost its value. So that is definitely something that should be given more attention. And I've been wanting to for us to pick it up and do something around it, or someone else to pick it up. But I think that's an important piece of wonderful recommendation that's just not been used properly. The last thing that I think is important is that when we talk about gendered access to justice, one of the important constituents of it is, I think, agency, which gets taken away when we talk about any violation of any right towards a woman. And there are laws that are there, there are guidelines that are there, they're sort of not in consonance with respecting the agency of a woman. Recently, I was working on this matter where the problem was that women who go to get medical help in case of domestic violence are told that, an MLC will be done and a complaint will be filed. Now, you taking away the decision from the woman to decide whether she's okay with filing a domestic violence case, a legal battle. We all know, we're all lawyers. We know it's not an easy game, and you don't know where a person's coming from. You don't know what her responsibilities are, what her issues are. And I understand the sentiment of, the government to say, if something wrong is happening, the police has to file an FIR. That is good, but consent cannot supersede that sentiment. Eventually, it has to be, you can't deny a person a medical treatment. You can't deny a woman access to medical care because she's so scared that if she does go for medical care, she may end up getting embroiled in a case which she doesn't want to take up against a partner who she's living with. So I think these are a couple of very doable things that are there. If only, mansha honi chahiye, niyat honi chahiye, if that desire, that intent is there, these are not very big things. And I think this would be a good starting point to sort of get these changes in place. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mishika. Jeevika?
I'm just going to pick up from some, agree with some, disagree with some, based on my movement in my own discourse. I think having been interned with the Justice Verma Committee, I was a huge proponent. Having lived my own reality of intersections, having worked with rural communities, coming from a Bahujan community, I think we need to move beyond it to actually looking at why it didn't work. And I think many feminists who've written it are now asking why it didn't work. It didn't work because it was caste blind. It didn't work. It was community blind. It was marginalization blind. Those who affected didn't have a say in it. So I think learning from it is a lot of, just taking something that changed so much of our criminal justice system. And I think the same issue, having worked on a big legal aid program as a director, the Fair Trial program at Project 39A, for 2 years, I think that's where the challenges lied, despite investing in that system, building fellows from the ground. How do you monitor quality when it's for the marginalized? How do you decide for them what's going to be working? Because they're there because they're marginalized. You don't have upper caste women or men unless they've done heinous crimes or they have political issues sitting in prisons or in the criminal justice system, right? So what's delayed is those who can't access it. So I think for me, the question then becomes, how do we empower communities? How do we fund communities? And I don't mean communities as in those at the forefront, but also those at the margins, to be able to decide how they negotiate with the law, what they think the law must provide to them, holding. And we can't do all of this without looking at state accountability, which is the feminist accountability question that's been asked globally, whether it's looking, when we look at justice across generation equality, Beijing plus 25, or we look at it locally, there are many women's policies coming up, Maharashtra being the latest. They're coming up with a gender policy, in fact. And so when we are moving to a gender spectrum from just women itself and looking at gender diverse people, girls, and, looking at that spectrum, how do we also start having these conversations? And how do we build capacities? As agreeing with Mishika, we build capacities, but for who? Right? And who's going to decide how we do this? And is there space for them in these systems? Because otherwise we're going to keep funding the same systems which have the same biases, the inherent systematic, we are looking at a colonialized system. So it's time to talk about a decolonial approach to criminality. And there are enough examples of this the world over. So how do we fund those models? How do we find those models, scale those models, and invest in perhaps women, girls, and gender diverse people who are actually willing to do it? And I think the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, where you are, Mrinalini, where Nikita is, I think it's a fantastic example of how to actually do this in practice and look at what we're bringing up from those learnings as well, and get the state to listen to us. And last, for those in power, which is a lot of upper caste or men, leave the space. Leave it for women who perhaps have the answers to what women's rights needs to mean, and within that marginalized communities. And I think that in the legal justice space, it's highly male dominated. Where, in the human rights space, and I think, especially when the Muslim women's question has come in, right? How do you decide what needs to be done? All the men, all the Hindus kept saying, go to litigate. But we've seen what litigation did. What else could have happened? And those are the critical questions communities are asking themselves. What happens next? Is there no space for these communities in litigation? Then where do you go? And I think those are some of the ways in which at least those working on gender and women's rights need to move if we're looking at it actually becoming an equitable space.
Thank you so much, Jeevika and Mrinalini.
Thank you so much for Jeevika for saying so much of what I was going to say. But I think beyond the law, before that, I do want to say resisting police action is something that was unchallenged for so long in this space. So we are engaging with the law on that front, and particularly because there are so many false cases that are filed against community members, and this impacts their access to other rights, right? So one is definitely that we do want to collectivize these communities, one, to be able to respond to this sort of policing by themselves, because lawyers are not always present. And again, the process of the law takes its own time. The second is also that maybe we all need to begin talking about what the impact of criminalization specifically does on other parts of people's lives also. The socioeconomic indicators for the communities that we work with are extremely low in terms of education, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of health. Recently, one of my colleagues was at the police station, and for a person who was again called to the police station for the umpteenth time, and she told me that the police officer had told the person, you're going to be going back to jail again soon, so why bother getting a job also, right? So why bother trying to make money? So I think this kind of thing is something we really need to talk about. And beyond this, something we I think have begun having conversations about because of the anti-carceral webinars that we'd organized last year. We do want to begin calling for decriminalization of certain kinds of offenses. Some of our studies are around acts that are less maybe glamorously noted in the media. Something like an excise policing might not seem much, but we see that it contributes to a huge number of arrests, and also many, many women who are also engaged in this trade for extremely small quantities. So why are these petty offenses still something that we are that we are still struggling to get through. So definitely decriminalization is a conversation we need to be having.
Thank you so much, Mrinalini. We'll start with questions. And then since Chandni has to leave, we'll stop in the middle, take a picture, and then Chandni can leave. The first question is,
in Shreyasi. Chandni, do you need to leave now or do you have a couple of minutes?
I asked them.
5 minutes, yeah.
Go ahead.
So what can transformative justice practices look like in India? And are there any examples that you would like to share? I think Chandni can take this one.
Well, there are examples from the UK, from the US when we talk of transformative justice. I'm not sure if I can think of practices of transformative justice coming from within India. But as we said, right, as we started this conversation, we said that we have the Domestic Violence Act, which is moving beyond the realm of the criminal justice system, right? So if there are practices which can move beyond the realm of the criminal justice system, because we know that, and we've spoken about this time and again, that the criminal justice system is not the answer to all questions, and it's not the answer to all gender-based crimes also. So I think if we are able to move forward from the typical conservative criminal justice system and looking at other remedies within the law itself, we also have, for example, POSH. We also have the sexual harassment law, which provides remedies, which gives the ICCs a lot of power to decide the kind of remedy or decide the kind of outcome of the case, as you might like to put it, based on talking to both the parties. So I think these are two examples from India which we can look at. These are two examples of legislations, fairly new legislations. And I think this is something where we need to explore further. We need to explore more. And yeah, that's where I'd like to end. Yeah.
Thank you, Chandni. If everyone could just smile for a photo and all right. Got it. Yeah.
I'm so sorry I have to leave early, but I have another session to conduct. And thank you so much for organizing this. And I hope you have a wonderful session ahead, and there are great questions coming ahead.
Thank you so much for being here and your insights, Chandni.
Thank you very much.
So we have a lot of questions that have come in, and anyone who wants to take them up, I'm just going to read them and you can just decide who wants to take them up, if that's okay. Cool. How do you imagine the spectrum of justice? Is the first question.
I think we covered this in the first starting point that, what is justice for you? So I think it's restorative justice. It's looking at justice that's beyond legal institutions. It's looking at support systems that exist outside of just courtrooms. I think these are the things that we discussed initially. I think that's a good spectrum of justice to look at, and definitely working across communities, caste lines, the different issues that we have in the society. Justice, like, we always talk about ki Kanun is equal for everyone. I think that's something that's only on paper. When we work on ground and see it in reality, that doesn't exist. I think the ideal situation would be for that to happen. And I think that's something to definitely work towards.
Thank you so much.
Fully agreeing. Can I just say two more words?
Yes,
I think it would just be, what Mrinalini said, decriminalization, looking beyond the prison and the punitive system, to look at what else is possible, because you're sending, the same people who perhaps have marginalizations which exacerbate crime as well. And also, how do you look at politics of gender, abolition that Angela Davis and many talk about today, and look at what lies beyond if you didn't work in the same frame. Also deepening what is currently there, because you can't just imagine without actually looking at what people engage with. So just that much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jeevika. Mrinalini, maybe you can take this next one. How can the physical infrastructure of the legal justice system be made more accessible to women, oppressed castes, and disabled persons?
I'm a little confused by what physical infrastructure would entail. If you're speaking directly within the court space itself, there is of course a lot of hostility, whether it's people who are called in as witnesses or whether it's the complainants themselves. I think we also don't think about it. Something that we do have within the Prevention of Atrocities Act that we don't see ever actually being accorded is things like travel allowance or compensation for the time that's spent. So that's definitely something we should be thinking about. I think there are a bunch of child-friendly procedures that we have written into the law for when minors are speaking in court. I think that exercise also can be repeated for persons with living with disabilities. Again, if there's more clarity on what the physical infrastructure refers to, I can add.
I think it means courtrooms and just the actual infrastructure. The next question, maybe Jeevika, you can take this one. How can the rape law and the POA Act talk to each other in the context of justice and redressal?
I think just the basic thing of putting the POA Act where it's necessary. Like, I think it's, even if we start its application in a whole and having some monitoring systems and repercussions for those who don't put it, right? Evaluating who doesn't put it, having those conversations, bringing it part of their reports, judges who don't speak about it when it comes up. Just beginning with that much instead of trying to reform and looking at new ways of redressal, because I think the letter of the law has it. It's the spirit of application that's where it's missing, according to me, is one way. And I think the other one is, how do you also look at these sort of trials? They're sensitive trials. There's a lot of pushback from communities. There's pushback to actually close these cases, right? Because they become community honor. They become about two communities being pitted against each other. So how do you also create support systems that make this applicable, right? How do you have social workers? How do you have workers from the oppressed community who feel they can sort of support these communities themselves? Because without all of this, nobody's going to reach the court for the trial. Women back off, right? Like, you see most of these cases just close as samjhota. Having worked with many, many such cases from the tribal community, at least 400, 500, I mean, I can tell you they close. And, then there are different pressures and there's money pressures and all of that. So how do you build systems, in which is the previous question around physical accessibility? What are your support services when you look physically, also in terms of human resources that support it? And within that, enough from that community to support it again and again. The same way as we say enough women to support it, right? You're not going to be able to speak up unless you have more gender sensitive people in the courtrooms who are going to also understand these spaces, and especially when there's a rape of a Dalit woman. And then how do you also build it in that you're not threatening those who put these cases? And I think someone asked the question of journalists, and I saw one of the questions there which I'm going to pick up and say, if you're going to threaten the journalists who report on these, like Hathras and others, then how do you expect this to even come up? So the fundamental basis of this law is constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech, legal recourse, not having political pressure. So I think a lot of this lies beyond just the courtroom. So
thank you so much, Jeevika. Mishika also has to drop off, so I just wanted to thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really wonderful to be a part of this panel. I was just messaging Vandita separately that this is definitely the most inspiring and enlightening panel that I've been a part of. It's truly amazing what OFC has gotten together. It's really great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Mishika. Moving on to the next question. How do we build safeguards to ensure non-legal methodology of justice does not oppress people further? Is the next question. Malavika, would you like to take this one?
I think non-legal methodology of justice is something I'm also trying to grapple with. But if there's some further clarification, I think that would be helpful. I could take up 2 other questions if that will help.
Okay, if you have the Jamboard.
Yeah.
do you want us to step in for
someone's
this one afterwards?
sorry?
We can do it. if you want, Mrinalini, you might want to take up this non-legal one
Yeah,
because I think,
that's what.
Yeah.
or we could take it up and then you, Malika, you can
Yeah,
take
yeah,
it.
please go ahead.
I think I've spoken a little bit about collectivization, which I think is so inherent to intro, and also respecting that not a single community speaks in one voice, but that their needs are always considered. That is something that we do want to be doing. I think the second is I will come back to this.
I just add to this, I think having worked with women's collectives who worked because most cases didn't reach, and they ran support services in police stations, they worked at legal support systems for survivors in the courts of law, but they also ran spaces for addressing legal questions in the community, is to capacity build, right? Build the capacities and principles of feminist justice, which talk about bringing up community issues, bringing up those violations in the community, also having conversations with those or empowered within marginalized communities or in any other communities as well. And I think trusting workers who are at the margins to be able to bring, bring that discourse into their work instead of saying, oh, any community-based mechanism is bad, right? Not everything in the community is equal to a Khap Panchayat. And I think a lot of us who come from urban discourses of broken down communities don't understand this. And I think the tribal understanding of we can ask for rights within our community while we continue to ask for rights outside is something that completely changed my understanding especially in denotified communities as well, because they're scared of criminal justice systems. They're scared of what will happen to their men when they negotiate criminal justice systems. Immediately, they're going to be put in 20 other cases. So at that time, also asking for their men to be accountable to them while also, stopping them from state repercussion. And I think that's something that's coming up again and again in Muslim communities today. So we can't deny this existence, right? So how do we strengthen women? And I think the greatest example has been seen in CA and RC protests, where they have asked questions in the community and asked outside. So, I think women have led that. They've asked their men the questions. They've in fact asked all others the questions as well, not only men in their own community. And I think these systems are possible. It's just about what you're building as the basic frame to be able to build on.
That makes a lot of sense. Since we're on this, there's a question about the issues faced by Muslim women and Hindu women and how they have been different. Jeevika, do you want to take this up?
Okay. I think just basic privilege and state, state lashback, and how the state sort of treats you as a dignified individual and a citizen, and the spectrum of just having dignified rights and not not living in fear. And I think just how you address and how you access justice changes when you live in fear, right? And I think that's the difference between even for Hindu men and women. And I think I spoke to a little bit of this in the last, when communities are threatened, how they access systems of justice changes. When communities are continuously facing a backlash, and within that women, right? Because women then become carriers of community rights and having to, talk about their own rights. So allow them the spaces to do it instead of coming with an outside view of how it needs to be done, right? And we've seen this in the bully deals and Suli deals cases as well. Those women, like the strongest cases online, have also spoken truth to power within their communities while talking about their right as Muslim women to speak up loudly. So I think offline, online, these are many examples of how you continue to do this, but it's very different, right? It's very different for how I would be violated and how the system would respond to me, what support systems I'd have, where I'd be stereotyped, where I'd face further backlash and be criminalized. And I think the latest of this is the row around the expression while being educated. Those young girls are now being criminalized for speaking up. So I think we need to start looking at this from a lens of privilege and say, if you're not minority, if you're not marginalized, you're privileged, and there is a difference.
And I'll also like to add that in many cases of violence that happens against like Muslim women online, that they're particularly being targeted for their minority. And on top of this, like, I think state action and like platform governance is very important here, because platforms also enable this sort of hate just so that they can make profit of their business models. Like that's what happened, like when the Kapil Mishra tweet that incited the Delhi riots happened on Facebook, it got almost 1.5 million views, and they left it hanging for like a couple of days, and that was perpetrating hate against a certain class of people. So that is also something that is very much visible in the online spectrum.
Yeah. Malavika, do you have any comments on intersection between journalism, women, and the law?
Yeah, so I think women that come out in the public sphere and put out their work are substantially targeted more. And this is also a group that we found, like, for example, we did a study on Twitter where we scrapped like a couple of mentions, and we were seeing what kind of women were particularly being targeted. We saw journalists, politicians, and women from Muslim minority communities, caste-based hate. Like, these were the categories that we found. But the most interesting thing is, when it comes to journalism and like digital media, like the way digital media has moved throughout, there's high amount of censorship that is happening from the state, one, and secondly, censorship on platforms itself. Like, you have these social media platforms themselves blocking accounts of journalists on, one, pressure from state, and secondly, on their own. So I think all this directly ties into censorship of women, especially journalists in media. This is not new to India. In fact, it's worse in Pakistan. It's worse in Nepal. It's a continued thing that you can see in South Asian like countries particularly. And I think the National Women in Media had a conference in December, and they released a report called Masculinity in Media. I think that is a very, very key finding, because that itself shows how misogyny and masculinity play a big role in the sort of hate and like violence that journalists have to face. Women journalists particularly. So I think there's a high degree of censorship also that comes in, and something that is also like something that shows how the digital media landscape is moving into a censorship model. They don't want people to speak up, and it is very clear online that that's how even the laws are being framed. So I think that is something that I'd point out here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Mrinalini, and this is the last question since we're already quite over time. What does reparation means for such violence and discrimination? I think they mean gender-based violence and discrimination here.
Actually, I'm going to talk from the context of our work, because the police violence we see is quite strong, and we do engage when we sit down either with our clients or in these community meetings. We do ask them, what is it that you want? For example, with the study we did around excise policing, we asked the women, what is it that you want? And they talked to us about how it came down to a livelihood question, that they cannot afford to educate their children otherwise, and that they can't eke out a living otherwise. So it's not that they particularly want this, but it's not that government reaches out to give them any jobs. So I think this comes back again to the other impacts of criminalization that I was talking about. There is conversation we need to have. Reparations can, of course, mean livelihoods, it means reservations, it means compensation, sure. And something that we are exploring right now is kind of also seeing what action we can push the police to take to either back off, or what kind of compensation we can seek for illegal detention or arbitrary arrests or torture and these things. So I think that's something I would go for. While talking about women or survivors of sexual violence specifically, I think Jeevika's already talked about this. Reparations, one, have to be very much focused on the needs of the survivor in the process, and and addressing the harm from their approach, whether it means being involved in a restorative circle with the person who's accused or who's responsible for causing the harm. And it can also mean material support in a myriad of ways. It can be support persons, it can be things that are already within like our posh policies. For example, it can be somebody being transferred to another department. I think that is what I would answer.
Thank you so much. With that, we're coming to a close to the discussion. I wanted to thank you for being here, for your insights, and for the work that you're doing.